Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this episode of the Surge Ahead podcast. I'm Dr. Shanna Katz-Katari, your hostess with the mostess. And as always, I'm delighted to have you join us as we share our research, teaching, and praxis experiences when it comes to sexuality, relationships, and gender. Today's guest is Dr. Melinda Chen, who uses she, her pronouns. Melinda is an assistant professor of women's and gender studies at the University of Oklahoma and a volunteer victim advocate with over 9 years of experience. Her first book, Killing Radicalism, Anti-Rape Advocacy Reimagined, from NYU Press, 2026, interviewed 63 victim advocates about their experiences supporting survivors of sexual assault under restrictive state funding conditions, finding that advocates' relationships with the government makes them complicit in the oppression of marginalized Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and asexual, immigrant, disabled, and related survivors. Dr. Chen has published in feminist studies journals like Violence Against Women and Social Movement Studies, and collaborates regularly with local anti-violence agencies to improve survivor justice, processes, and policies. She currently serves as the member-at-large of the Governing Council of the National Women's Studies Association, the largest womanist and feminist studies professional association nationally, and is the director of the Carceral Studies Consortium at Oklahoma University. Is that University of Oklahoma? University of Oklahoma?
University of Oklahoma.
Thank you. A research activist group dedicated to the study and practice of anti-carcelism and abolitionism. Melinda, welcome to our show. I am so excited to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And as someone who's an active part of the Sexuality, Relationship, and Gender Research Collective, I've been lucky enough to hear about some of what you've been up to. But so that all of us and our listeners are on the same page, will you tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and how you got here?
Yeah. So I am Melinda, Dr. Chen. I've been at the University of Oklahoma for about 4 years, going into my fifth year. And a lot of my work is centered around helping work and what does it mean to actually be supportive to those people that we're helping out. And so I want to ask like a very simple question, which sort of frames my research overall, which is how do we help? And I think that when we first hear that response or that question, excuse me, we think about like, oh, yeah, we can help out by pitching in some funds, like in a GoFundMe, or we can help out by like giving a helping hand, like extending a hand if somebody falls down and you need to bring them back up. And it's a really seemingly simple question, but once we start unpacking what that actually means, it starts getting really complicated really, really fast. And so let's take a more um, applied example. So if somebody, for example, is, let's say, unhoused and they're trying to find a place to live, how do we help is really, really difficult because you're running into questions of like, why is this person unhoused in the first place? What are some social services that currently exist? What are some challenges that that person might be encountering into, let's say, getting into a shelter? They might have a criminal record, for instance. They might not like the people at the shelter. They might be trans and it's a women's only shelter, cis women's shelter, right? So all of those other challenges start getting much more compounded when we think about how we actually can support that individual person in need. So my work is just centered around this question, and most of the work is applied to issues of sexual violence. So I call it sexual violence because I do see it as like an act involving sexual organs, and that's how I define sexual violence. I know that other folks might use the term like gender-based violence, for example, or they might use some other terms like sexual assault or rape. And I use those terms sometimes depending on the context, but for the most part, I talk about it in sexual violence. Now, I apply how do we help to issues of sexual violence. And so my research has been primarily investigating the responses to sexual violence survivors and what it then means for their communities. So in my recently published book, Killing Radicalism, I take this question of how do we help and apply it to things like how do victim advocates provide supplies to survivors? Like, what does their inventory look like? And how do they actually get those supplies in the works, in the building, so that they can then distribute it out again? I also take this question to like grant writing. So victim advocates might write some grants to get some funding for helping out survivors, and that is a way of helping. But then I also challenge and investigate like what are the other things that occur when you take this narrowed path of helping work. I think that's a start to the introduction, but I'll wait for kind of further questions on what that's
Yeah,
like.
absolutely. I really appreciate how you situate your use of the term sexual violence as compared to, other framings of that. And I think for a lot of our listeners, whether it's hearing academics talk, community organizers, practitioners, etc., we often talk in abbreviations, in acronyms all the time, right? And people are like, what are the differences? So I do just want to let folks know that they might also hear the term IPV, or intimate partner violence, and that
Right.
can include sexual violence, but also includes other things that might be like financial control or emotional manipulation and violence, right? And here what you were talking about is specifically sexual violence that could include intimate partners, but also sexual dating violence and straight, any type of thing around that. Um, and I'm trying to think what I was just wanting to ask. You narrowed it down a little bit to talk about helping. I think people just get so caught up in this, like there's one true way to help, right? And that the people who have been trained in it know that this is what we do. So I'm wondering how has this, like, I don't want to say pushback, but maybe like critique of some of the ways that we do helping, how has that been received by people that you're speaking to and with?
This is a great question. So all of my work tends to be applied in some way. I really love theory, but I also really love when I see that theory done in practice, right? And so when I like was writing the book, I actually gave an early manuscript copy over to several advocates who were practicing on the ground, who kind of knew me as like this researcher who's kind of been like in their circles, but like not necessarily like with them all the time. And they read it. A couple of them, read only a couple chapters. Some of them read the full book, which I was like, that's great. I don't know how you had time to read a 350-page book, but I'm glad that you did. And they gave me feedback, and their feedback was like, "Hey, your your book has a lot of critique, right? And how do we actually do this in a way that's not going to reinstate the same problems?" And so I actually ended up taking a really hard look at my critique because I went, okay, this is what academics do, right? We parse out and disentangle those different threads. And then now the challenge is how do we put them back together? And in my work, helping is is kind of like this esoteric term, but like when we think about it in a day-to-day context, helping can look like, hey, I'm sitting down with you and I'm going to listen. And I also totally forgot what your main question was. So could you
I was
repeat
just
that one more time?
wondering, what has been the reception, right? And you've already
Oh,
answered it a little
yeah.
bit, but of this, like,
Hmm.
you know, critiquing the way that, help has always been thought about. And I've worked in the nonprofit industrial complex. Many of us, who are part of the collective have or still do, right? And I train students that are going, who are currently interning in nonprofits and who, and we often as a society hold up of like nonprofits are the true way, right? Like you donate your money to nonprofits instead of mutual aid. You follow their guidance. And I think not only in when we're talking about sexual violence, but also like queer and trans advocacy, health advocacy, generally politics and political advocacy. There's a lot of space to critique help, and I'm just wondering, how has that been received as you do that work?
Yeah, I've gotten several advocate social workers, certainly plenty of law enforcement, like tell me to my face, like, oh, yeah, that's not how we do things here. And then also that they're like, oh, it's not possible. And to me, that sort of feels like a defeatist attitude. And maybe I'm just like following along the queer optimism. And maybe that's a pitfall, if we think about Lauren Berlant's work, right, and cruel optimism. But if we were to just be like optimistic for a second and look at what things are improved, then, I think that outcomes could be very, very different for survivors, and circumstances and living could look very different and in a beautiful, joyous way, as folks and survivors should feel. Um, Definitely with the social workers, it's been probably the most challenging. I was teaching a class called Sex, Race, and Violence, which is on the very topic of like what happens when you have compounded, racialized, intersectional sexual violence. And one of my students was a social work student and was rooted very, very deeply in the Black social work tradition. So she like already completely got it in terms of like how sometimes helping work could not necessarily support survivors. But what she found really challenging was her role in constructing that harm. Because she was like, well, I've been trained in this entire other tradition, this very radical Black tradition of, free food programs and unconditional housing and shelter, right? That's the kind of tradition she was coming from. But she couldn't see how even participating as a social worker, where you have to be licensed, where you have to be credentialed, where you have to get continuing education hours, like she had a hard time grasping with that reality of like, even if you have all the right intentions, even if you know that this is harmful, ultimately by doing this work, because we're imbricated in the system always, you are still going to participate in it. The challenge really then is how do you reduce those harms and what is your stake? How are you going to resist that every single way throughout the process? And I really love Chanel Gallant's work in Abolish Social Work. There's a chapter in there where Gallant writes, like, the only good social worker is a criminalized social worker. And I was like, yes, that's absolutely the way that we go about it, because if you're going to be implicated in the system anyway, you might as well take some of it down with you and also build something else in its place. So that's been the reception.
Can you, for our listeners, define what you mean by a criminalized social worker? Because I'm sure some people are going to
Mm.
hear that and be, "Oh my gosh, what do you mean by that?" And I think as we're getting people more familiar with this language, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's coming from abolitionist feminisms and queer work generally, where let me backtrack for a second. So when I say abolition, I really mean two things. One, I mean dismantling harmful structures, and two, building up liberatory spaces. That's kind of what abolition means. It's not about, I mean, yeah, you could like burn it all down, but also that's not the end of our work. The end of the work is building a safer and liberated world.
Yeah, the
Like
world
that
that we all
is,
deserve. Yes.
yeah, to live free and dignified lives, right? And so abolitionist perspectives understand that social work is not necessarily um, is not as helpful because of its roots deeply within like white Protestant social work culture. And what I mean by that is that you have somebody who's like this outsider with wealth, with power coming in and helping the poor masses in need. That's the general system upon which the current framework of how we help is relying upon. And so the criminalized social worker takes this all into understanding and says, like, we actually don't need to start with this idea that somebody from the outside is coming in and helping out the poor masses in need. Instead, what we're saying is that person who's in the community who has the idea or intent or motivation to make something else of the world is the one who's doing the helping and sparking change throughout the community. And when you take that definition of what social work could be, then you start seeing waves, right, in your community that are going to then branch out. The criminalized social worker is therefore, I suppose, somebody who is an insider to the community, who understands the challenges, who is also resisting and right in dismantling that harmful system, that dominant system, and is also from the ground up building something that is actually going to be helpful for those communities. we call them criminalized social workers because they tend to be considered people who are going against the rules or going against the status quo. And so they're criminalized, they're seen as other, they're seen as somebody who is not doing the right thing as a result.
Thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate that because, if you are new to this work, or not as familiar with it, it can seem like this thing of like, oh, we want to criminalize the people that are doing something different that are good. And I'm like, yes, that is how society works, right? And I think that like even you and I are criminalized academics because I often think about my role as someone who exists within an academic institution, particularly a PWI, predominantly white institution. We could talk about the ivory tower, the cis tower, the male tower, right? Like all of these things. And I'm
Etc.
like, you know, by being here, um, I am pushing against systems, right? People who, even just the way I look, right? I've got bright red hair, tattoos. People often come in and are like, oh, you don't look like a professor. And I'm like, check, that was a success for me, right? Um, and I often think about what harm I am doing simply by being in this system, by upholding this system, by, I joke that I'm the unicorn, right? In that, I can go into spaces that are like, great, we have a trans, disabled, neurodivergent, Jewish, person that can like check many boxes. And so simply by being here, I let people off the hook about having to do work in some of these areas because I'm fat too, right? So I get all of the students with those identities get sent to me to, when there's problems or to offer support. When students are getting misgendered, they're like, oh, Dr. K, how do I do this? And I'm that person that holds that. And we were talking before the call about, what does it mean to get credit for the work that you're doing anyways? And many of us don't ever get those credits in those ways. And so, um, you know, I really struggle with that. And so for folks who are listening, who are advocates, who are in nonprofits, this is not in any way to say that you are a bad person for being where you are and doing the work you do. What it is saying is that, in the same way that like white people are upholding white supremacy, whether we want to or not, and benefit from white privilege, right? Those of us that are in systems are upholding those systems even as we are trying to dismantle and change them. We see this a lot with the child welfare system, right? Most of the people I know in child welfare are aggressively critical of it. And they're like, I need to be here because if it's not me in this system, it's going to be someone who maybe isn't as critical, or maybe it's this, which is a great start. And we can't stop there, right? Because the goal is still to actually dismantle these systems, or, at the very least, to radically change what they are. So, um, yeah, I got super off track with all my questions. I was just very excited about that. And yeah, I also want folks who are maybe new to this work to think about learning more about transformative justice. Is a great, motion forward. As you were talking, I'm thinking about the book Beyond Survival: Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement, which is an edited collection by Dixon and Papenza Samarasina. That just is wonderful. I think is that AK Press. Yeah, that's
It
an
is.
AK Press book. Um, but also, we do this till we free us. There's just some really wonderful books out there that are welcoming and a great place that, for me at least, really filled my heart when I was thinking about how do we move away from systems that are oppressive while still perhaps being connected to them as there is change. Um, so with that, you talked about threads and using this tapestry to create that there's different threads of anti-rape activism over the years to make a tapestry. um, how do you figure out this metaphor to you talked about pulling threads as an academic, and what does it look like to pull threads? What happens when you pull the wrong thread, and how do you know when you've pulled the right ones?
Ooh, wait, this is such a good question. Let me explain, just to like give a quick, brief snapshot of what the threads mean, and then I'll go into the question of like how did I figure it out, and then also like what happens when you have a wrong thread. So, the thread metaphor that I use in chapter one of the book is uh, coming from, and really should give absolute credit to the authors here, is from M. Jackie Alexander and Chandra Mohanty's Feminist Genealogies, Colonial Legacies, and Democratic Futures, where they argue that different feminist threads across the globe have historically been starting, like their origin point has been in the global north, and then they go to all of the other third world feminisms, which is not the way that you want to do things. They argue instead we go from the local context to other local contexts, and those are the real threads that's coming out and performing and doing and creating this transnational feminisms. But in the book, I take this threads metaphor and parse it into essentially three categories. So the first thread is looking at rape law reform. And in that thread, I trace a couple of like key moments where we know that significant federal or even state legislation helped to establish like a basis for what we want to see happen in terms of protections for survivors, in terms of accountability for perpetrators. That is the sort of base level. And if you know anything about anti-violence activism, you also know that it's an extremely carceral approach. What I mean by that, it is the sort of reliance on a criminal legal system that mass incarcerates, particularly racial minorities, especially Black and Indigenous Latinx folks. It criminalizes trans folks, gender diverse folks. You know, you go down the list, you will have um, that sort of response by the criminal legal system towards those individuals. And in thread one, I show, you know, here are some laws and here's some effectiveness. But what we also see is this like massive surge in law enforcement involvement in sexual violence responses. And that's no good. Second thread jumps off of that point to argue, hey, there have been a bunch of grassroots organizers who have been doing this work for a while. And I name things like the Black Women's Liberation Committee, which later on became the Third World Women's Alliance, or TWWA for short, where they were kind of the first ones of the 1970s feminist wave, that sort of spike that we see in the movement at that time period, they were the first ones, and they were like women of color, femmes of color, who were doing work to recognize sexual violence as something that's harmful for communities, and also doing something about it. So they were deliberately publishing a lot of newsletters around this. They talked about the double jeopardy at the time, which we now call intersectionality. They talked a lot about like, hey, we need to actually have like arms those perpetrators. And that is something where it's really important to center the works of and the labor that it took by particularly femmes of color, by those folks who were not typically recognized by dominant mainstream movement historians. And so thread two is just like centered all on these like grassroots activists and it's really really cool one to like go and search this, but it's also too important to recognize them because not only were they the first people to really do this, but also too it is they're giving us a different perspective of how we approach the problem of sexual violence. Now, the third thread is where it gets super tricky, and I want to be really careful here because the third thread is kind of a combination of all threads, but also not like collapsing those differences within the threads. It's instead taking this abolitionist approach and this like um, temporally situated approach. It's more focused on the process by which we come to know anti-violence histories. And thread three goes in and argues like thread number one, which focuses on rape law reform, and thread number two, which focuses on grassroots organizing. Those are both legitimate, although one probably has uh, more comprehensive and holistic and supportive responses. But both of those threads are still kind of valid in our histories. And I say in our histories very specifically. I don't mean that we should, you know, just extrapolate the thread one and just like drop it into today's moment. Absolutely not what I'm talking about. Instead, what I'm talking about is those two threads are valid because it gives us knowledge of what has worked in the past, and then also what are the directions we should be taking in the future. And so as a result, then that thread becomes really helpful for thinking about how do we create new types of strategizing to respond to sexual violence in effective ways. That sort of idea of thread three in particular, but really the threads idea was drawn from Ruth Wilson Gilmore's fabulous work around abolitionist geographies. And what she's arguing in that text is that in multiple texts of her work is that instead of thinking about like tracing that one thing happened to correlate and have a solidly known effect in the future, right? Instead of taking that approach, we should be taking like the mass array of the different types of approaches that are helpful or have been shown to be helpful, and then start like piecing them apart, pulling them apart, showing different patterns that emerge in the past, and then re-putting them back together. One great example of this is thinking about, sort of the faith communities, which when we think about that in terms of sexual violence, we often, at least in my perspective, I think the mainstream response is like, well, the church is a site of abuse. We know that the Catholic Church, for example, has been doing abuse for a while, and that there was actually even an apology made recently for it, right? So we think about that. But faith communities, if we turn it on its head and we say, like, okay, let's look at some of these faith communities and the shelters that they then built out. Those shelters are actually really helpful for survivors, even though they're not directly talking about sexual violence. Like none of these kinds of experiences ever recorded it. We probably know that they did probably talk about sexual violence because that was a big thing even then. But faith communities, those shelters that they built, particularly in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, they were spaces where survivors could feel heard because they were getting support for, skills training so that they can get employment, so that they can work and have a livable wage, and therefore that they can create their own lives and live freely. Now, this is also a capitalist perspective, but the big but here is that even that was a step towards understanding what is actually going to be helpful now. So instead of thinking about like faith communities are not super helpful, or instead of thinking about we just get them employment and then they get a wage and therefore they're good. We take those two separate parts and then repiece them together in the present so that in the future, probably we can have some sort of model for housing for survivors that's actually going to be helpful for them, where they can, um, you know, pay for the things that they want, or maybe not even have to pay for some of the things that they need. So that's the sort of um, thread metaphor and kind of where it comes from. So thinking about like Gilmore and also Alexander Mohanty's work. Now you
Can I
asked a really
stop you for a second? Because I just want to note, you kept saying but. I want to introduce you and our listeners to yes and, right? Is it
yes
like,
and yes.
absolutely like, yes, there are these challenges, and this is also a space that has educated us around what we could do moving forward, right? And that we don't have to, just like you were saying, binaries don't serve us in saying it's either this or it's that. It's how do we take them and say like there is a multitude of possibilities that we can build on, or that we could weave into our tapestry, perhaps, in order to create something new. So now I'll let you continue, but I was just like, yes, you're saying all these things,
Yes
and my
and
brain was like, yes, and
yeah, I should do that more often. I have been, and thank you for the reminder. It is yes and when we talk, because also like this is something where I think the victim advocate in me would probably be like, yes, and I don't know what you're talking about in terms of but as an academic, I'm like, oh no, I can't be like talking about like these messiness. So it's good to remind ourselves, like remind me specifically to think about those different intersections and what hats we're wearing always. But or and you had asked about the wrong thread and how do we know whether or not we've picked the wrong thread. And I think that's a really interesting question for when it comes to sexual violence, because if we do pick the wrong thread, right, it becomes super dangerous. And I mean that really literally. If we say, like, okay, um, let's take one example actually that I've been thinking about right now, especially. So I've been thinking a lot about like restorative justice and what that means for survivors. We have restorative justice because we argue that it's better than criminal legal justice, and it is like point blank. It has been more effective for getting survivors heard and like also sometimes challenging how abusers or people who commit harm, um, getting them to change their perspectives. Restorative justice, in the context of sexual violence, often runs into the question of like safety. Like we want to make sure that the survivor is still alive at the end of it. Um, and the wrong thread idea, I was just thinking about like, okay, so if we take restorative justice as our thread, we take those kind of strategies and we piecemeal them together from what we've learned in the past to the future, right? If we take that and we rethread it along, is there a possibility that that thread will lead to some sort of further harm, or maybe we chose that wrong thread, we endorsed restorative justice too early, um, which, is a side conversation about like Indigenous folks have been using restorative justice and blah 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 earlier in the thread. But if we choose wrongly, that survivor who goes through, let's say, restorative justice instead of criminal legal justice might end up dead. That is a very real possibility. We actually have research that shows, that even though restorative justice is better than criminal legal justice, it's only better by like 10 to 15%, which is a lot. It's better than the less than 1% that we get out of the criminal legal system, right? But it is not entirely uh, it's a not the 100% golden thread that we want to have, that we are for sure knowing that that thread will lead to some sort of good outcome or liberatory outcome, right? And my response to that has to be really delicate, right? Because on the one hand, that survivor, there is always a possibility of danger and harm, and there's always a possibility that somebody will not change their ways and continue to harm others. And that thread is by then default, it is wrong because somebody will be hurt. It is also wrong then, though, to say that we should just not commit to that thread at all. Because as a tapestry metaphor will tell us, we're still kind of threading out the histories. This is not like we're at the moment, the culmination of all of our past in this moment. We're building the bridge as we make it, or we're threading the thread as we're making that tapestry. And I really love what some of the advocates in the book were telling me because they were like, yeah, we understand that that pathway, this alternatives that you're bringing up could be wrong. And there's also death and danger. We know that. But also, if we don't start threading out a different pathway, we'll never get to that end point that we are looking for. And so this is where, the having a mechanism of sorts to check us every once in a while is helpful. So I think there's been multiple maps. So like interrupting criminalization, which is like a abolitionist anti-prison group located in New York City. They have a really wonderful like map where they say like, okay, is this going to be actually helpful for people? Yes, no, don't do it, right? So we just have to keep in mind those sort of checks and balances of our own work. Like say like, okay, we've done this thing, we've followed restorative justice, we've done like mediation, let's say. We've gone down those pathways. If something does occur that is harmful or is not right and we feel it in our gut, then we go back, trace our steps back, go like, okay, what exactly was the thing that made this really dangerous? And then try to map it differently for the next person or thread it differently for the next person. And those sorts of like each thread is going to be different for everybody in each circumstance, but it's also important to then still have that idea of like we're going to check ourselves along the way, and that's how we're going to get and address those wrongful threads.
I really love your framing around that. And I think, two things that came out of that for me are things that I often see in the social workers I train, in the communities that I organize with, is that one is that this work is iterative, right? It's not that, we do the next right thing. We don't have to know what the entire future is. And then if it's not the right thing, we back up a bit and we try something different. And that's also why it's important to do this work in community and not in isolation, is to have those folks, who might be like, hey, actually this isn't work, this project might be your baby, but it's not doing what we hoped it would, or it's working really well for this group of people and is then harming this other group that it's doing this way. The other thing is that I really appreciate about what you said is, we're trying something because we have to move forward. We have to do something. And I think often, especially for folks who are newer to social justice work or who are coming from maybe more privileged places, one response to being called in around things is this feeling of being frozen, right? Like I just don't know what the right thing to do is. I'm waiting for someone to tell me what the right thing to do is, or they're all wrong answers, right? Nothing is going to be 100%. And so we often and I think this comes out of certainly white supremacy and cishet patriarchy, bootstrap models, etc. Is this like we let perfection be the enemy of progress. And, we are not going to dismantle any of these systems overnight. And we also don't want something where we just dismantle them with nothing as an alternative or in place, right? Like, I mean, I guess that's maybe an anarchist approach, but we want to build something. We want there to be some sort of thing to move towards, right? And so yes, do something. And if it's not, I mean, obviously don't do something out of nowhere, like build on, our ancestral lineages, build on these threads, build on the knowledge of all these people who have been doing this work. And you might try something and be like, oh, that is, that is harming people, or it's harming people in a different way than we even thought of. And that doesn't necessarily mean anything is okay. There's no one true answer. So it's going back and saying, okay, is this salvageable? Do we do something a little different with it, or is this not the right direction? And how do we go somewhere else with that? So, yeah, I really appreciate that because I think people get super stuck. Um,
Yeah, and I have been recently thinking a lot about like stuckness and what that would mean for some folks, and then also have been heavily thinking about like sort of indigenous sovereignty work where um, progress is not really a narrative that a lot of folks can do, especially if you're indigenous and especially if like, the world is apocalyptic, right? You are going to be stuck. Um, and I think that that stuckness is still some sort of momentum. And Leanne Simpson has this really great commentary about movement as social justice in their work, where they argue, like, well, for my people, that's what Simpson's saying, for my people, movement is kinetic. So even if you are stuck, even if you're stuck in this apocalyptic world and you can't really escape that, you are still in a moment that you weren't in before, and we could learn from the past to do and make similar strides to move again. And it's not necessarily about like, you go from point A to point B always, or and then points B to C, right? It's going to be a lot of different ways. You can go from point A to point L to point B to point Z, right? Like it's not going to be linear, but movement is how we are going to get out of this situation, or at least work towards building that world where we want to live in.
mm, actually connect you back to my therapy from this past week about processing anger and frustration and fear, right? Is it's like you don't have to solve it. You don't have to like anger is a productive emotion or whatever that means. Like it's a valid emotion. You can feel it. And how do we move it through our bodies? How do we move, with something? And so like whether it is movement like capital M movement of what we are doing like conceptually as community, or like just individual spaces of like moving your body as you're able. My therapist and I were working on like moving my heavy water cup side to side. You can kind of hear the ice tingling because it's something other than being stuck in that, feeling. Going outside and touching grass, as the kids say, doing something. So I had a couple more questions, and then we have a question from a listener. Um, you have shared that you want work to queer what needs to be done to continue to support survivors of all backgrounds. Now, you're using queer as a verb, which is familiar for some of our listeners and newer for others. So, can you just give a quick description of what that means? And also, do folks need to be queer in order to contribute to the queering of our work?
Good question. And I also love talking about queer theory because it's kind of my jam. I do use queer as a verb. And I take heed from Brown and Nash's Queering Methodologies, which is a fantastic book. There's also like other work that's been built off of that textbook, essentially, or collection. So like Ghaziani and Brim's work on imagining queer methods as well is also fantastic. So queer as a verb is essentially thinking about how do we deconstruct the binary, but it's not just about it's not just about like that deconstruction of the binary, right? It's also thinking about like how do you exist without putting up categorical boundaries of exclusion or inclusion up there. And in my work, throughout my work, I use queer as a verb in the sense of like I want to make sure that the responses that we take for survivors and their communities are not setting up some artificial boundary or binary between who can be helped and who can't be helped, right? And this is coming from, the queer folks, the queer communities, particularly gender diverse, trans, non-binary folks, who think about, gender as not necessarily being a binary construct between men and women or male and female, but rather thinking about it as more fluid and thinking about like what then does gender mean in once we've detached it from this sort of like coupling that we've artificially placed on the way that we present and live and engage with folks in the world. And I think an applied example of this is when we think about a very simple premise within the book. So, like in chapter 2, I make this argument that like we need to queer the kinds of material supplies that we give to survivors, right? We have, for instance, like this ideal victim who is typically portrayed as like white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, neurotypical, US citizen, speaks English, right? That's the ideal victim. And then we have everyone else who does not fit into that category. We have all those marginalized others, marginalized survivors. Well, in our current framing of doing the main sort of support to survivors, we start with that very ideal victim perspective. And then we move to, hey, here is like what differences that the person might need. I'm arguing that that sort of setup does not work at all. We need to queer that. We need to start with the idea that instead of having an ideal versus marginalized support service, we need to actually start with what do you need first and then go towards that. Here's an applied example. So when we take a survivor who, for instance, let's say is indigenous, they might be very traditional, right? And there might be even some services that are for them, like sweat lodge or, um, burning sage, like as a traditional practice, right? We might take those kinds of practices and put them in a mainstream rape crisis center. But if we don't queer the rape crisis center itself, then how the heck is that Indigenous survivor ever going to know that those services exist? And also, even if that service does exist, is it going to be performed by that person's community person, like their medicine band, for example? Is that going to be something that's performed by somebody else? So we start instead of saying, like, okay, we're a mainstream rape crisis center, we could do all of this other work for Indigenous victims. We have like these, one, two, three services. Instead of starting there, we say, okay, what do you need? And then how am I going to link up to your community to make sure that that community that already has those resources, that already is doing this sort of work, can then modify it within the community for that individual survivor. I hope that answers your question.
It absolutely does. And while we won't get into it today, some members of the collective led by Kelsey Reeder, who was our first guest on this, are writing a piece about queering and transing research. And I think that's, the way that you just framed it of like, what do you need and how do we build from there is very much this idea of queering and transing research of like, what do communities need from us and how do we build our research agendas around them and led by them instead of saying, this is the thing I want to study, and then how do we, recruit people to be part of that and suddenly add a community advisory board and call it a day. So, just as we were writing this, I'm like, there's so many similarities between research, teaching, and praxis. And I think we think about these as really separate areas. But for me, the threads, if you will, that we've been talking about today, right, is that this is where they intertwine, is this framing of things. I have just been alerted by our wonderful intern that we are going way over on time,
Yeah, so
because
I'm
we're having
super.
such a great conversation. I did want to ask the kind of two final questions that I ask everybody. So the first is, what is one takeaway that you want everyone listening today to know after hearing you speak?
Takeaway will be always keep in mind that this fight is going to be bigger than you and it will outlive you. But and that is not something to be like shying away from. And so instead of seeing it as like something that you can't really contribute to or that, it's all on you if you're one of those people, we're in a collective, we're in a community with a bunch of different people. The movement will outlive you and we'll continue onwards and hopefully we'll make some great changes along the way.
Hmm, I love that. And, the world it's apocalyptic, empire is falling, we are in tough times. What is one thing you are doing to center joy right now in your personal or professional life, or both?
One thing, well, I this is real like well, this is personal. I love cooking and I love baking. I have always challenged myself to do really complicated recipes and try to figure out like how does it work and doesn't work and it's been great. I mean, definitely been like some burnt food sometimes, but it works out. One thing that I've been finding sort of joy in has been to go back and really focus on like these long simmering stews kind of recipes that take a lot of time to build complex flavors that um, aren't like I've been doing a lot of quick stir fries previously over the last couple months. So like recently I've been sort of shifting back into that slow cooking process and grounding myself there.
That's beautiful. I also enjoy cooking and am a soup slut, if you will. So,
Oh,
uh,
really?
oh, I for my sabbatical, I made a new soup every week was part of my personal sabbatical plan that I hadn't made before, so that I was trying different things and as a we always
Dang,
talk
hit me
about
up on some recipes.
yeah, yeah, we should definitely exchange. I will say I'm vegetarian and gluten free, so it's a smaller portion, but yeah, when we talk about sabbaticals, we talk about like what are you doing, to be productive during this time for work, but I was like, what is something I'm going to do to be productive for my heart? And it was making a lot of soups and stews. And then, talking about abolition, we host a community dinner once a month, in our backyard of local queer and trans and disabled and COVID cautious, mostly folks. And I just make some sort of gluten free, vegan, nut free situation every month. And anybody can come and eat. And we've talked about like the social change eco map and abolition and planting gardens together and did seed starting. And so, yeah, we just really encourage folks to like, I know, when we talk about things like abolition, it can feel really overwhelming, but like the first piece for us is, yeah, investing more deeply in our community here and creating that space. So whatever, cooking is a great way to do that. With that, where can people find more about you and your work?
Sure. So I am on the website melinda-chen.net. You can also find me on the University of Oklahoma webpage uh, underneath the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. You also find me on the Carceral Studies Consortium webpage, where I'll also be there as well. I have a research gate, and I also have LinkedIn. So if you connect me via there, I might not check as often, but I do have those as well.
Wonderful. All those links will be in the description. Thank you so much, Dr. Chen, for your work and your sharing of yourself on the show with all of us. And thank you, gentle listeners, for engaging with the Surge Ahead podcast as we work to bring our research, praxis, and pedagogy to life during these trying times. Visit srgcollective.com for this and other episodes, as well as to learn more about the work we're currently doing. You can also find us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky, where you can ask questions of myself and or our guests, suggest future topics, and find out other ways to engage with our work. Together, we can build the world that we all deserve. Remember, we take care of us. I'm Dr. Shanna Katz-Katari, signing off.